The morning sun painted the Philippine Sea in shades of amber and gold. Young Electrician's mate, Orville Bethard, stood on the flight deck of the USS St. scanning the horizon with salt-stung eyes. The carrier had been renamed just 15 days earlier, from Midway to St. After the fierce battle in France, where American forces had broken through Nazi defenses, Bethard couldn't have known that his ship would soon earn a darker distinction in history. At 10:47 a.m., radar screens across Task Unit Taffy 3 began to light up. Enemy aircraft, incoming fast. But these weren't ordinary attack planes. Lieutenant Yukio Seki and his fellow pilots of the Shikishima Special Attack Unit had made a pact with death itself. They called themselves tokko Special Attack Forces. The Americans would call them kamikazes, after the divine wind that had once saved Japan from Mongol invasion in 1281. By the autumn of 1944, Imperial Japan stood at the precipice of total defeat. The once mighty carrier force that had struck Pearl Harbor lay at the bottom of the Pacific. The battles of Midway, the Eastern Solomons, and Santa Cruz had systematically destroyed Japan's carefully trained carrier pilotsmen who had spent years in specialized schools learning their deadly craft. These weren't simply good pilots. They were the elite, irreplaceable masters of their art. The statistics told a grim story. Before the war, Japan had based its entire strategy on a quick, decisive victory. They had no comprehensive programs to replace the mounting losses. When a pilot died, his years of training died with him. The training pipeline that had once produced such superb aviators could not be expanded quickly enough. By 1944, American submarines had severed the oil and rubber pipeline from Southeast Asia. B-29 bombers now menaced Japanese cities from newly captured bases in the Marianas. The noose was tightening. On October 19, 1944, Admiral Tokajiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, called a meeting at Mabalakit Airfield in the Philippines. The admiral was a stocky man with a stern face, weathered by decades of naval service. He addressed the senior pilots of the 201st Air Group with brutal honesty. Japan's salvation no longer depends on civilian and military leaders, he told them. His voice steady but heavy with the weight of what he was asking. It depends on you and your body-hitting spirit. He was asking them to die. Not just to risk death in combat all warriors, accept that possibility, but to guarantee it. To transform themselves into human missiles, their planes loaded with bombs and extra fuel tanks, aimed directly at American warships. One plane, one ship, that was the hope, the desperate calculation. When Onishi finished speaking, according to witnesses, the room erupted in a frenzy of emotion and joy. Every pilot volunteered, whether this was genuine fervor, peer pressure, or simply the logical conclusion of a warrior culture that valued death before dishonor, we can never fully know. But the die was cast. To understand the kamikaze, we must first understand the culture that created them. In Japanese military tradition, a soldier's life belonged to the emperor. Death in service wasn't seen as throwing away a life, but as fulfilling one's highest duty. The concept of gyokusaitu, die rather than surrender, was deeply ingrained. We had already seen it in the desperate banzai charges in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, where Japanese soldiers hurled themselves at American positions in suicidal waves. But the kamikaze took this to another level entirely. This was planned, organized suicide on an industrial scale. The pilots received special ceremonies before their final flights. They wore ceremonial headbands, drank sake, and wrote farewell letters to their families. Some of these letters survive today, windows into the hearts of men about to die. Flying Petty Officer First Class Iso Matsuo, wrote to his parents on the eve of an April 1945 mission. "Dear parents, please congratulate me. I have been given a splendid opportunity to die. This is my last day." How does a 20-year-old man write such words? What combination of indoctrination, honor culture, peer pressure, and genuine belief allows someone to embrace their own death so completely? These questions haunt us still. Let us return to Orville Bethard, standing on the deck of the St. Lo, on that October morning, the young Californian had joined the Navy, expecting to serve aboard a vital component of America's Pacific Fleet, launching aircraft against distant enemy targets, perhaps one day sailing victoriously into Tokyo Bay. He had not imagined what was about to unfold. The St. Lo was part of a unit nicknamed Taffy 36, small escort carriers screened by 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. These weren't the mighty fleet carriers like Enterprise or Yorktown. They were smaller vessels with wooden flight decks and thin armor, designed primarily to provide air support for amphibious operations. They were vulnerable, and they were about to face not just kamikaze aircraft, but the Japanese center force battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that had slipped through American defenses and were now bearing down on the vulnerable escort carriers. The Battle of Samar was beginning, and it would become one of the most desperate naval engagements in American history. For 90 minutes, the outgunned American destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3 fought with reckless courage against the Japanese heavy ships. The destroyer Johnston, under Captain Ernest Evans, charged directly at the Japanese force at flank speed, trading shots with cruisers and battleships that outweighed her by thousands of tons. The Americans threw up smoke screens, launched torpedoes, and prayed. Against all odds, the ferocity of the American defense convinced the Japanese commander that he faced a much larger force. The Japanese center force began to withdraw. Taffy 3 had survived the surface engagement, but now came the kamikazes. At 10:47 a.m., all 6 escort carriers came under concentrated attack by the Shikishima Special Attack Unit. For 40 minutes, the sky filled with diving aircraft, trailing smoke and fire. American anti-aircraft batteries firing desperately, tracer rounds arcing through the air like lethal fireworks. Bethard watched as a Mitsubishi Zero fighter emerged from the chaos, flying low over the water, then suddenly pulling up. The plane was damaged. The American gunners had struck it, but the pilot maintained control. Lieutenant Yukio Seki, or perhaps one of his fellow pilots, had originally been aiming for the carrier White Plains, but damage forced a change of target. The Zero came at the St. Lo from the port side. The pilot dropped his 550-pound bomb. First it punched through the wooden flight deck and exploded in the hangar deck below, where aircraft were being refueled and rearmed. Then the Zero itself smashed into the flight deck. He crashed his plane on the deck, Bethard would later recall. And that explosion on the hangar deck, we blew ourselves apart from there because we were gassing up planes. Bombs out, no real protection, fire everywhere. The torpedo bay blew. The St. Lo had become a floating inferno. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship 1, 2, 3, 4 times. The torpedo and bomb magazines detonated. Fire consumed everything. The carrier's captain gave the order to abandon ship. 30 minutes after the kamikaze struck, the St. Lo capsized and sank. Of the 889 men aboard, 113 were killed immediately or went missing. Approximately 30 more would die of their wounds. Bethard survived, plucked from the oil-slicked water by rescue vessels. The St. Lo held the grim distinction of being the first major American warship to be sunk by a kamikaze attack. She would not be the last. By April 1945, the American juggernaut was closing in on Japan itself. The island of Okinawa, just 340 miles from the Japanese mainland, became the next objective. Operation Iceberg would be the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific Theater, larger even than the D-Day landings in Europe. More than 60,000 soldiers and Marines stormed ashore on April 1, 1945. Initially, resistance seemed light. The Japanese had learned from previous island battles that meeting the Americans at the beach was futile. Instead, they had dug into the rocky, craggy southern terrain, creating an underground fortress designed to inflict maximum casualties. Above the island, Japanese commanders prepared their most ambitious kamikaze campaign yet. Operation Tengo. Operation Heaven called for massed suicide attacks on the American invasion fleet. The goal was to sink enough ships, kill enough sailors, to make the invasion of Japan itself seem too costly to contemplate. At 3 p.m. on April 6, 5 days after the initial landings, the first wave struck. 355 kamikaze aircraft and 344 escort fighters launched from airfields in southern Kyushu. The attacks lasted 5 hours. First-class boatswain's mate John Chapman, a 21-year-old gun captain aboard the destroyer USS Newcomb, watched them come. There was probably 45 planes in the air. He would later recall, "Well, it was a scary situation, because you knew that they were going to dive on you. You could be firing on the aircraft, and they'd come right on. Just keep coming right on through that, and you'd see pieces flying off the planes, and everything else. And they'd just keep right on coming." This was what made kamikaze attacks so psychologically devastating. In conventional combat, a pilot under fire might break off, seeking to survive to fight another day. But these pilots had already accepted death. Damage that would drive away a normal aircraft only seemed to make the kamikazes more determined. Even with control surfaces shot away, they would crash into their targets. The Newcomb was hit by 5 kamikazes. 4 others were shot down by the destroyer's guns. Chapman watched his shipmates burn. "I don't know whether that's terrified or not," he said later. "But it didn't make you feel too well, knowing that people would do a thing like that. People we had always known weren't like that. They were brave people and fought, but weren't someone to just deliberately take their lives to take yours." 22 kamikazes penetrated the combat air patrol shield on that first day. 6 ships were sunk, 18 more were damaged. 350 American sailors died. And this was just the beginning. To provide early warning of incoming attacks, the Navy positioned destroyers and smaller vessels on radar picket duty stations 50 to 60 miles out from the main fleet. These ships were the first line of defense, and they paid a terrible price. The USS Taffy, a destroyer on picket duty, earned the nickname the ship that would not die. On April 16, she survived 6 kamikaze hits and 4 bomb strikes in 80 minutes of continuous attack. Her crew fought through fire, flooding, and continuous assault, refusing to abandon ship. Somehow, impossibly, the Taffy survived. Not all were so fortunate. The USS Manat El Abil became the first ship to be sunk by an Oka-Balma rocket-powered kamikaze aircraft carried beneath a bomber and released near the target. The Oka could reach speeds of 400 miles per hour in its final dive. American sailors called them Baka bombs, Baka being Japanese for fool or idiot. The aircraft carrier USS Bunker Hill was the flagship of Task Force 58. Carrying Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher and Rear Admiral Arla Burke. She was a proud ship, having earned 11 battle stars in campaigns from the Solomon Islands to the Philippines. On the morning of May 11th, she was operating between Okinawa and Kyushu, launching strikes against Japanese airfields. The flight deck was crowded with aircraft being fueled and armed for another mission. It was the worst possible time to be attacked. At 9:58 a.m., Lieutenant Junior Grade Shizu Yasunori emerged from low cloud cover. The Bunker Hill's radar operators, hampered by a sudden rainstorm, had not detected the approaching aircraft. Yasunori dove toward the flight deck, opened fire with his machine guns, dropped his 550-pound bomb, and crashed into the flight deck aft. 30 seconds later, just 30 seconds, Ensign Kiyoshi Ogawa followed his leader in. His bomb struck forward of the island's superstructure, penetrating into the ready rooms where pilots waited for their missions. Then Ogawa's Zero smashed into the island itself. The flight deck became hell on earth. Fully fueled and armed aircraft exploded in chain reactions. Aviation gasoline flowed across the deck like a river of fire. Below decks, in the narrow passageways and ready rooms, men were trapped by walls of flame. The ready rooms where just moments before pilots had been joking and playing cards became crematoriums. Captain George Seitz ordered the ship hard to port, trying to spill some of the burning fuel and debris over the side. The light cruiser USS Wilkes-Barre pulled alongside and trained her fire hoses on the burning carrier. Other ships in the task force closed in to help. For hours, the crew of the Bunker Hill fought to save their ship. Men formed human chains to pass firefighting equipment. Sailors risked their lives to rescue trapped shipmates from below decks. Salvage diver Robert Schock volunteered to go deep into the bowels of the burning ship, where Ensign Ogawa's Zero had finally come to rest. Schock found the half-submerged wreck and the body of the pilot. He recovered Ogawa's blood-stained name tag, a smashed watch, and his parachute harness buckle items he would hide and bring home after the war. Admiral Mitcher was forced to transfer his flag by Britcher's buoy pulley system that carried him and his surviving staff across to another ship. 13 members of his staff had been killed in the inferno. His flag cabin was destroyed, along with all his uniforms, personal papers, and possessions. He arrived aboard the carrier Enterprise, looking, one witness noted, tired and old and just plain mad. The Bunker Hill somehow survived. Through the courage and determination of her crew, the fires were brought under control. But the cost was staggering. 396 sailors and airmen killed, including 43 who were never found. Another 264 were wounded. It was the single most destructive kamikaze attack of the entire war. The following day, the Bunker Hill survivors spent the afternoon conducting burials at sea for their fallen shipmates. The carrier limped home to Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. The war would end while she was still under repair. She would never see combat again. By the time the Battle of Okinawa ended on June 22, 1945, the numbers told a story of unprecedented naval carnage, nearly 2,000. Japanese pilots had flown kamikaze missions. 36 American warships were sunk, minus 368 ships were damaged to 4,907 Navy sailors and officers were killed. 4,824 were wounded. This was the highest loss of life the U.S. Navy suffered in any single battle of World War II, greater even than Pearl Harbor. More than 3,900 kamikaze sorties were flown during the Okinawa campaign. Despite massive anti-aircraft barrages, combat air patrols, and radar detection, approximately 14% of the kamikazes that reached their target areas managed to hit a ship. Once a kamikaze pilot began his final dive, he had nearly a 1 in 2 chance of hitting or damaging his target. The ships that suffered most were the destroyers and smaller vessels on radar picket duty. While no fleet carriers, battleships, or cruisers were sunk by kamikazes at Okinawa. The smaller vessels paid in blood. The destroyer USS Kidd was hit on April 11th, killing 38 sailors and wounding 55, nearly one-third of her crew. The survivors fought fires and subsequent attacks on their stricken vessel, refusing to abandon ship. Today, the rebuilt Kidd serves as a museum ship in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, a floating memorial to her crew's courage. As the war dragged on and defeat became inevitable, the nature of the kamikaze force changed dramatically. The early volunteersmen, like Lieutenant Seki and Ensign Ogawa, experienced pilots. Motivated by a complex mixture of honor, duty, and cultural conditioning. Many genuinely believed they were saving Japan and their families from destruction. But as volunteers dried up, conscripts increasingly filled the ranks. By April 1945, many kamikaze pilots were flying to their deaths, drunk and bitter. Aware that the war was lost and their sacrifice meaningless. Training time had been cut to the bare minimum, just enough flight instruction to take off and aim at a ship. Some pilots had never even practiced landing. One pilot, in an act of ultimate rebellion, strafed his own command post after takeoff. This story, though rarely told in Japanese histories, speaks to the desperation and resentment that grew among the later kamikaze pilots. The Japanese High Command exaggerated the effectiveness of the attacks, claiming they had sunk 6 aircraft carriers, an escort carrier, and 10 battleships. The reality was far different. While the kamikazes inflicted terrible casualties and damage, they failed to sink any fleet carriers, battleships, or cruisers. The only vessels sent to the bottom were escort carriers, destroyers, and smaller ships. By 1945, the U.S. Navy was so large that damaged ships could be sent home for repairs without significantly hampering operations. What had seemed like a war-winning strategy proved to be a costly failure. The kamikazes sacrificed approximately 3,900 pilots, 2,525 from the Imperial Japanese Navy and 1,387 from the Imperial Japanese Army, without achieving their strategic objectives. The kamikaze attacks tested the limits of human endurance. Sailors had to stand at battle stations for hours, watching the sky, knowing that at any moment a flaming aircraft might emerge from the clouds. The psychological toll was immense. Ships' medical officers reported increasing cases of combat fatigue, what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. The Navy developed increasingly sophisticated defense measures. Radar picket ships were positioned farther out to provide earlier warning. Combat air patrols were increased. Anti-aircraft batteries were enhanced, and crews drilled endlessly. The Navy experimented with airborne early warning aircraft, converted B-17 bombers carrying radar and fighter direction controllers, but no defense was perfect. The kamikazes exploited every limitation in American radar and anti-aircraft systems. They attacked at dawn and dusk, when visibility was poor. They approached low over the water to avoid radar detection. They hid in clouds and used the sun as cover. Japanese radar snoopers aggressively probed the picket lines, seeking gaps and weak points. The kamikaze attacks at Okinawa had a profound effect on American strategic planning. President Harry Truman, who had taken office following Franklin D. Roosevelt's death on April 12, less than 2 weeks into the Okinawa battle, faced a terrible decision. Plans for Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands, projected casualties that made even hardened generals blanch. If the Japanese had defended Okinawa, single island, with such fanaticism, what would they do to defend Japan itself? Intelligence estimates suggested that the Japanese had thousands of aircraft hidden throughout the home islands. ready to be used in kamikaze attacks against an invasion force. Some estimates predicted millions of American casualties. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 were influenced, in part, by the carnage at Okinawa. Whether this justifies the use of atomic weapons remains one of history's most contentious debates. But there is no question that the kamikaze attacks and the broader picture of Japanese willingness to fight to the death shaped American thinking about how to end the war. On August 15, 1945, 4 U.S. destroyers 100 miles south of Honshu, Japan, shot down a lone Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber. It was the final anti-aircraft action of World War II, and quite possibly the last kamikaze attack attempt of the war. In 2001, the son of Robert Schoch, the salvage diver who had recovered items from Ensign Ogawa's Zero aboard the Bunker Hill, found his father's war souvenirs, a blood-stained name tag, a smashed watch, and a parachute harness buckle. These items were returned to Ogawa's niece and grandniece in a ceremony in San Francisco that year. This small act of closure reminds us that behind every statistic, every tactical decision, every burning ship, there were human beings. The kamikaze pilots were someone's son, someone's brother, someone's friend. The American sailors they killed left behind grieving families. The survivors on both sides carried psychological scars for the rest of their lives. John Chapman, the young gun captain aboard the USS Newcomb, would later reflect on his service with clear-eyed honesty. People try to glorify wars and so forth. There's people that do outstanding things, but there's nothing really glorious about a war. You do wars to protect your country if you have to, and that's the only time you should ever do it. Bruce Myers, a gunner's mate aboard the Bunker Hill, spent decades trying to forget what he had seen. When he came across a photograph of his dead shipmates in a book about the carrier, he walked out of his office and, in his own words, cried like a baby for an hour. I had stood in that same spot and saw those bodies. The kamikaze phenomenon remains unique in military history. Never before or since has a modern industrial nation deliberately organized mass suicide attacks on such a scale. The word kamikaze has entered the global lexicon as a synonym for suicidal fanaticism. For Japan, the memory of the kamikaze is complex and contested. Some see the pilots as tragic heroes, victims of a militaristic regime that threw away young lives in a futile cause. Others view them as genuine patriots who sacrificed themselves for their country. The debate continues to this day. For the United States Navy, the kamikaze attacks at Okinawa represent the service's bloodiest battle of World War II. The sacrifices of the men who stood at their posts, who fought the fires, who refused to abandon their ships, earned the eternal gratitude of their nation. Many received medals for valor. Ships like the USS Taffy became legends. Today, the wreck of the USS St. rests at the bottom of the Philippine Sea, nearly 14,000 feet down. In 2017, the research vessel Petrel, funded by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, located and photographed the wreck. The ship's hull, number 63s, still clearly visible on the bow, lying among the scattered debris of the carrier. The St. is a war grave, the final resting place of the 113 men who died that October day in 1944. The kamikaze attacks claimed 4,900 American naval personnel killed. They damaged or sank hundreds of ships. They terrorized sailors and tested the limits of human courage. But they failed to stop the American advance or save Japan from defeat. In the end, the divine wind that once saved Japan from invasion in 1281 could not save her in 1945. The kamikazes wrote a chapter in military history marked by fanaticism, desperation, and extraordinary courage on both sides. It is a chapter that should never be forgotten and never be repeated. The last kamikaze was shot down on August 15, 1945. The wind finally fell silent.